Hello and welcome to this MIMH training special event, Missouri Asylums, Their History and Evolution. A brief overview of the history of the department's inpatient psychiatric hospitals from their initial founding to the present day. Today our speakers are Dr. Felix Vincenz, and he's the Associate Director of Missouri Institute of Mental Health and also the Chief Operating Officer of the St. Louis Psychiatric Rehabilitation Center here in St. Louis. Joining him today is Amanda Hunyar. Amanda is the librarian and archivist for St. Louis Psychiatric Rehab Center, and they're going to talk to us about the Missouri Asylums and their history and evolution. Take it away.
Good afternoon, everyone. Amanda and I are absolutely delighted to be able to give you a little bit of an overview of a topic that's near and dear to our heart, which is the asylums here in Missouri. We're going to have some opportunity for some discussion betwixt us and the audience, and our producer Kelly Gregory will be giving you some questions from time to time. Feel free to chime right on in, because we would love to be able to have some measure of dialogue with you. One of the things I do want to share with the audience is that many of the slides that I'm giving you are borrowed liberally or stolen shamelessly from Dr. Robert Reitz, who is the Director of Facility Operations for the Division of Behavioral Health, who put together a predecessor to this particular presentation. So let's get to it here. One of my questions, again for the audience, is to get some idea from those of you who are attending is, what do you think preceded the asylum? Where did people go for mental health services and treatment in the early 1800s all the way through the 1850s? And we'll give you an opportunity to chime in on that.
And so we'll have a slight delay as people are sometimes as much as 20 seconds behind us, so we're going to go ahead and get the refresh to put your questions in via the questions button, and I'll look and I'll read your answers when they come in. So be ready. And so far we don't have anybody answering yet, Dr. Vincenz.
So no brave souls willing to risk something here?
Come on now. There's no wrong answers.
Oh, here we go. We have somebody. Oh, it's already a question. Do you want to have questions intermixed with your questions, or do you just want to answer your questions? So we have a question from a person that asks if you see all the state hospitals going away or closing, or do you think that there's going to be some structure to them?
What a wonderful question. I'd like that particular individual to save that question to the very end, because we have a discussion about our future toward the end of the presentation.
Okay, we haven't got. Why don't you re-ask your question again, just in case?
Again, what I'm looking for are people's ideas about where people with serious and persistent mental health needs, where they went for care and treatment prior to the 1850s.
Okay, we have another answer in here. They said they went to jails or prisons.
Oh, absolutely correct. I'm very impressed by the audience, and again, I want to thank that individual for putting that answer out there. The sad reality was that prior to the 1850s, there really wasn't anything much in the way of treatment available to folks. Instead, in increasing orders of likelihood, people were either detained in the family home, attics or basements with mom and dad or brothers and sisters. A small percentage of folks were in what were known as almshouses. These were local establishments maintained by a church on behalf of people who would otherwise be homeless, and individuals with serious and persistent mental illness were disproportionately represented among this population. There was another entity called the Poor Farm that was maintained by a number of the counties, again on behalf of individuals who would otherwise be homeless. And so many of the individuals with serious and persistent mental illness ended up in those settings. Of course, people did end up being homeless despite those kinds of settings, and a substantial percentage of the people, even back then, had a serious and persistent mental illness or substance use disorder. But the answer that is the most correct, and again, provided by our studio audience there, was incarceration in jails or prisons. So many of those folks were actually detained in those venues, often chained to the walls, suffering pretty brutal and inhumane conditions.
Well, fun fact, not fun, sad fact, but the St. Louis County Poor Farm was on the corner of Arsenal and Kings Highway.
Very much close to where we have our facility today.
Mm-hmm.
Well, that pretty much persisted as the solution for people with serious and persistent mental illness, such as it was, until the 18th century's Age of Enlightenment. And things began to change. Not so much in this country as it did in Europe and others, and it came with what was known the introduction of the moral treatment model. So let's talk a little bit about the moral treatment model. The key philosophical points behind this was that people who were struggling with emotional or mental illness would be given the opportunity to have rest and recuperation away from whatever it was that was stressing them. And for most people, that meant the opportunity to sort of get away from their urban environments and go off to the countryside where they were exposed to fresh air, sunshine, clean water, the opportunity to participate in a variety of recreational or leisure events, and to participate in some rehabilitative work. And they would be cared for by staff who would live among them in sort of family-style living arrangements, and the staff's major responsibility was to treat them with dignity and respect. The basic precept, the moral in the moral treatment model, was that patient outcomes really depended upon their conduct. People were recognized as having agency and moral autonomy over their behavior, and they were rewarded for displaying good conduct, and experienced some minor punishments, typically some restraint for poor behavior, but without the abuse that was typically associated with being in a correctional or jail environment.
So in other words, treating the person and not just the symptoms?
Exactly.
Shocking.
Now, the originators of all of this, again, remember, this is the Age of Enlightenment. There were several physician names that are typically tied to this particular model. Vincenzo Ciraghi, Philippe Pinel, and I'm going to be butchering the pronunciation on these, Jean Esquinel, and then a patient advocate by the name of Jean-Baptiste Poussol. A very famous individual, a minister and reformer in England by the name of Samuel Tukey. Now, a lot of this began in a Parisian hospital by the name of La Bicêtre, and that was run by Dr. Pinel. Now, it made a huge difference in the Parisian environment for the clients who were able to leave some of the more primitive jail and correctional environments to go to that setting. But it was very slowly adopted through the rest of this world, and the transition to the USA was particularly slow, painful, and not particularly widespread until the 1840s, some 60 years later from the formation of La Bicêtre. Now, interestingly enough, even prior to La Bicêtre, there was another introduction of this kind of model by the Quakers in Pennsylvania. It was, however, not a hospital, but they did set aside some beds for the treatment of individuals with mental illness back in 1752. But it took later pioneers, people like Benjamin Rush, a Pennsylvania physician from the late 1800s, the late 1700s to the early 1800s. But the big name, and one of my personal heroines, was Dorothea Dix. Dorothea Dix was a Boston school teacher, social work reformer, someone we'd call today a social worker, and she had a long conversation with Samuel Tukey in England, and he was the one who introduced her to the concept of what was going on in Paris at La Bicêtre. And she was enormously excited about this. She had actually done a bit of a review, and there's a picture of Dorothea right there. She had done a review of a variety of correctional institutions in New Jersey, some in New York, some even in Boston, and was actually aghast at what she observed in those particular settings. So what she did was she then proceeded to testify up and down the Eastern Seaboard at all the General Assemblies who would be willing to have her speak, and talked a little bit about the necessity for the asylum and the need to introduce it into the shores, to the shores of the United States. And she was personally credited with having led to the formation of some 32 state psychiatric hospitals that offered the moral treatment model. And by the by, she came to Missouri too in 1844 and testified before the Missouri General Assembly, a model of efficiency and effectiveness, much like it is today. They listened to her very kindly, very respectfully, and unfortunately did absolutely nothing. Now, that changed, however, not very much long thereafter, with the suicide of the 7th governor of Missouri, Governor Thomas Reynolds, later that year, and his successor, Lieutenant Governor Marmaduke, championed the creation of the first public psychiatric asylum west of the Mississippi, and that's Fulton State Hospital. I want the audience to think here for a moment. West of the Mississippi is a vast, vast piece of our country, and Fulton State Hospital was the very first one in that entire area. Now, she came back to Missouri and actually visited Fulton State Hospital, one of the 32 for which she's given credit, in 1859, and donated a variety of items, and some recreational items as well, to the patient population at that time. So I'm going to show you some pictures here of some of what we see at the variety of the asylums in Missouri. In our left corner, you'll see actually a picture of the sewing room at St. Louis Psychiatric Rehabilitation Center in 1904, and then a diversional party event at Nevada State Hospital to the right. Below that and to the left, the farm at Fulton State Hospital, and the last one, an industrial program also at Nevada State Hospital. So this gives you sort of a smattering of some of what was available to the patients in those venues. Now, one of the things to recognize is that all the hospitals that were constructed pretty much through the 1840s, very much until the turn of the 20th century, were built in accordance with what's known as the Kirkbride Plan. The Kirkbride Plan was a brainchild of a very famous Philadelphia psychiatrist, Thomas Kirkbride, who promoted a particular architectural style. They had some variations, but what they all had in common was multi-story buildings built around a central spire or dome. And there were long wings, typically arranged in sort of a bat wing or staggered, known as an echelon fashion. So each wing, though connected to the other right behind it, didn't block or impede the view of the patients in those wings so that they could look out over the rolling green countryside, again have fresh air, sunshine, etc. And the purpose of the dome at that time was to actually provide air conditioning, because again these multi-story buildings needed to be vented. This was before central air, and so they had louvers that enabled all the hot air to escape out of the buildings. And each wing contained a stack of wards, and each ward was complete unto itself. Kirkbride prescribed that each of these hospitals had to be built on massive campuses, so at a minimum there were going to be about 100 acres in size, because again, the hospital had to feed its patients, feed its staff, and that required some sprawling farmland to be able to do that. Now, the Kirkbride Plan also called for all the staff, again, to live on the hospital grounds, including the superintendent. It required that the staff be balanced by gender. There was a concern that female patients needed to be taken care of by people of their own gender, and so there was a real effort to try and result in some balancing there. Kirkbride prescribed the staffing plan, prescribed even the salaries that the various different staff were to earn, and you can see some examples of that, and you can see that no one made a fortune working for the departments of mental health back then, and these buildings, in companionship with the moral treatment model, were believed to be restorative, if not actually curative. Now, unfortunately, they tended to fall out of favor by the turn of the 20th century, and we'll get a little bit into why that was in a few moments. So, what about moral treatment? Let me ask the key question again of the audience. You guys heard me talk about some of the key philosophical components. You heard me talk about it within the context of the Kirkbride Plan. Do you think it worked? Did it do what it was set out to do?
Okay, well, we're going to wait just a minute here for folks to come in. So just my background, because I worked at the what we call the St. Louis State Hospital, used to be called that. Was that part of the Kirkbride plan? Was that
It was. St. Louis State Hospital, in fact, was one of the quintessential examples of the Kirkbride model, and we'll have a chance to view some pictures in a moment, and you'll see why that was.
Oh, I hope I didn't blow that for you there with asking that question.
Not in the least.
It was a preview of things to come.
There you go.
Coming attractions. Oops.
And we haven't got anybody to answer that one yet. Why don't you ask it one more time, Dr.
So
Vincenz?
did the moral treatment work? Did all those initial patients coming into these state hospitals actually get better? And people need to remember that this was before psychopharmacology, this was before Freud, this was before Jung, this was before anything that we would recognize as an evidence-based practice. So did it work?
All right, we have an answer. It worked until they became too crowded.
Marvelous. Again, what a brilliant audience. That's exactly the right answer. And we know that it worked from a couple of sources. The very first being actually the professional literature at the time, which included many examples on how efficacious the moral treatment model was. But I've had the pleasure of being the superintendent at both St. Louis Psych Rehab Center and at Fulton State Hospital, and I've had an opportunity to look at the original medical records of some of the very first patients who were admitted to those facilities. And these are large leather-bound volumes, and the admission note isn't from a psychiatrist or a social worker or a nurse. It's actually the night watchman, what we would call a security officer, and he would write the diagnostic formulation of the time, some of those quite interesting. But the most interesting thing about that is 2 weeks, 2 months later, you'd see the discharge note, and the patient's record name would no longer appear in the record thereafter. So again, it worked.
A lot of people were mentioning on their comments, we have several comments for that come in now, that it worked better than the prison or jail system at the time.
Absolutely. It certainly did that. So now let me ask the next question. I'm sorry, Amanda, you were going to make some observation?
Oh, I was just going to say, the other thing as far as the records go, first of all, they were written in impeccable handwriting. I was very jealous of that. But oftentimes, like he said, in a week or 2 months or whatever, if the person's name did appear as a discharge, it would say improved or cured or whatever the person decided to say.
So again, there was a lot of reason for optimism behind these facilities and what the moral treatment model had to offer. But if I were to ask the people in the audience again to consider the term asylum for a moment, or to use another pejorative in front of it, such as insane asylum or mental health hospital, I want you to all think about the various different associations that come immediately flooding into your mind. And I'd love, again, the people in the audience to share some of those, to talk a little bit about what associations do you have, what particular connotations are aroused by the term asylum.
It can even be as simple as a title of a TV show or movie.
All right, we're waiting for folks to come in here. I was going to say when you said TV show or movie, that was something that came into my mind. I was trying to remember the name of the series that I think that used it recently was...
Oh yes, we'll get to that one. I'm sure someone in the audience will remember that.
I think everybody is feverishly typing in their answers.
Okay.
Just takes a second to get to us.
Which is kind of sad if you think about it, that we can all immediately come up with like 20 different answers to that question.
Oh, we have an answer here. Well, one person put in several other words that it reminds them of, so insane, crazy, weird, lunatic.
Yes, all those sort of pejorative kinds of adjectives, absolutely.
And we got another one here which mentions the movie One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest, so Cuckoo's Nest.
That's a favorite among many people when they think of the term asylum. And generally, that's not a very pleasant depiction for those of us who've seen One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest.
And then we finally got the one I think I alluded to, which was American Horror Story.
That's it. American Horror Story, second season. And again, what these associations all have in common, and I tend to sort of conjure this vivid image in my own mind, it's this sort of spooky, haunted mansion somewhere on a hill, thunder and lightning crashing in the background, people in straitjackets wandering around laughing maniacally.
Flickering lights.
Physicians in long white lab coats who are even scarier than the patients given how they treat them.
With monocles.
With monocles, that's a great ad.
And twirling mustaches.
So then I guess the Addams Family played that for comedy in a way, the same kind of motif.
They did.
That's a really good point.
And, and again, depending upon one's age, one's particular generation growing up, there are many different other common sort of social medias, or what we, social media ideas or memes, however we would want to call that, that are evoked by the idea of the asylum. Some people talk about Nightmare on Elm Street. Some people talk about the very shows that we've talked about. But they all have in common a uniformly dark, dire, and negative image.
One person put in here Bedlam, which was the name of one of the a place in the United States, right?
Absolutely. And depending upon age, people my age or older might remember Snake Pit. That was another movie that first came out about a hospital to our immediate west in Kansas.
That's a good book.
So, is that what Dorothea Dix was shooting for? Why is it that all the common associations to the term asylum are so uniformly negative? Because clearly Dorothea Dix wasn't looking for that. What explains that? What explains all those negative associations? And one of the people who responded earlier actually kind of gave that away.
I'm trying to remember which one that was.
Yeah, which one was that?
Well, I think someone in the audience said it worked at first and then things got overcrowded.
Oh, right.
I usually make an allusion to another movie at this time, and again, people my age will certainly be familiar with it, but does anyone recall the movie Field of Dreams with Kevin Costner? And there's a signature line from that particular film that really explains it all. And that line is, if you build it, they will come. And that's not just true of baseball fields right amidst the corn rows in Iowa. It's also true of the asylum. Remember all those people in almshouses and in poor farms, all those people homeless on the streets, detained in their mom and dad's attic or basement, and above all those people in jails and prisons. People saw an opportunity to cost shift, to be able to move this burden to somewhere else. And people came flooding into the asylums. And the things to remember here is that Fulton State Hospital, when it opened, actually had, I think, 125 beds. And St. Louis Psych Rehab Center in St. Louis, when it opened, had 300 beds. And the very day that St. Louis Psych opened, we had 125 patients, I think, 175 patients come from the county poor farm, and 125 patients come via wagon train from Fulton because they were that number over capacity. And in very short order, hospitals that were meant to house 100 or 200 or 300 patients had literally thousands of patients crammed into them. And under that kind of population pressure, the moral treatment model collapsed. And gone was the expectation that people would get better, would improve, would be discharged, would be able to return to their home community. Instead, what got written over the entrance, at least metaphorically, was the term "abandon hope, all ye who enter here." People just came, they lived their lives there, and they died there. In fact, most of the hospitals had cemeteries attached to them, poor cemeteries, again, where people were just cremated and shoved in a hole, often with no marker at all. And so, again, that clearly wasn't what Dorothea Dix was going for, because the term asylum is supposed to be sanctuary, safe haven, a place of safety. And under those kinds of population pressures, that concept broke down, and all the negative associations so many of you spoke to are what took its place. And there is a picture right there of some of the crowding that was actually representative of what took place. This was supposed to be a day room, but instead it became a large dormitory where beds were crammed into every nook and cranny. So that moral treatment model's collapse toward the latter half of the 19th century really presaged through much of what occurred in the 20th up through the 1950s and early 1960s. So when I speak about St. Louis State Hospital having as many as 4,400 patients in it, that was actually in the late 50s, early 60s. We're not talking forever ago, certainly within my lifetime. So let's talk about some of the historical developments that took place. We already spoke about the moral treatment model, and then as these facilities began to just accumulate and stack patients up like cordwood, a number of different treatments began to be introduced. Hydrotherapy, industrial occupational therapy, insulin shock, ECTs, and lobotomies in the 1940s. Many of those procedures associated with mortality rates as high as 2 to 3%. And it wasn't until the 1950s that we actually began to see some potentially positive things occur with the introduction of antipsychotic medications, with the discoveries of both thorazine and Mellaril. 1960s were also notable for the racial integration of our treatment environments. Prior to this time, individuals of color were actually detained in either separate hospitals or separate sections of the hospital. And the other thing that took place in the 60s was the beginning of the deinstitutionalization movement, or the community mental health center movement, that began with John Fitzgerald Kennedy and actually made its way into law due to the efforts of his successor, Lyndon Baines Johnson. The 1990s saw the introduction of evidence-based psychosocial rehabilitation treatment into the inpatient environments, at least here in Missouri. So here's some pictures I want to share. What we see here is a picture from Southeast Missouri Mental Health Center of hydrotherapy, or the water cure as it was called. Patients were packed into small tubs in either hot or water, or into absolutely cold water with sometimes ice sheets wrapped around them. And the intent here was that the shock that these treatments would provide, or the calming effects of the hot water, would really serve to help regulate people who were otherwise too agitated to comfortably interact with by the staff. Other treatments, as I mentioned, were insulin shock, ECT, lobotomies, lobectomies, and here you see some pictures of some of these procedures at St. Joe State Hospital. Here you see a picture of a pharmacy from Fulton State Hospital with the advent of antipsychotic or psychotropic medications. Here's a picture of the first integrated dance at Fulton State Hospital. Now, one of the things for folks to understand is that prior to the 1960s, all these asylums were what I would describe as full-service psychiatric hospitals with full medical capacity. And what do I mean by that? Well, I meant that they treated everyone. They had acute, intermediate, and long-term inpatient psychiatric treatment. They had emergency rooms. They had outpatient clinics. They had satellite clinics. St. Louis maintained clinics as far south as Farmington, as far southwest as Ironton. They served children, adolescents, geropsychiatry patients, individuals with intellectual disabilities, people who had substance use disorders, people who had acute psychiatric disorders, as well as the more severe, chronic, and persistent forms, and people who had just problems in living, or perhaps were creating problems in living for some of their compatriots. And they had full operating theaters in them, physical therapy suites, occupational therapy suites. They were really full-service psychiatric providers. Here you see a hospital from Southeast Missouri Mental Health Center, the old Farmington State Hospital. Now, things began to change for the asylums in the 1990s. all the long-term care beds that were previously serving individuals who had guardians or who might have been civilly committed or who might have actually been voluntarily admitted and just stayed for a long time, began to transition into forensic beds. State hospitals, but not our community mental health centers, began to discontinue all service lines that were not forensic. So all those other service lines that I described for you a few moments ago began to go away. I remember one of my first assignments when I was an assistant superintendent of treatment in 1989 was to close many of those service lines. I remember shutting down an emergency room, closing the outpatient clinic, and closing all the geropsychiatry wards. And all the outpatient centers, whether in state hospitals or the mental health centers, were privatized as community mental health centers, sometimes partnering with existing outpatient community mental health centers, sometimes becoming ones out of whole cloth. The other big change that happened in fiscal year 2012 is that inpatient redesign occurred. In response to some real budgetary challenges at the departmental level, the department was forced to close all acute care beds and move those to the private sector and transition the remaining beds into additional forensic capacity. And by forensic, I mean having to do with the law. This means individuals who are criminally committed, either as not guilty by reason of mental disease or defect, or as incompetent to stand trial as a result of a criminal offense that was associated with a mental illness. So that's what I mean by forensic. So facilities like the Center for Behavioral Medicine, Metropolitan Psych Center, or Southeast Missouri Mental Health Center all transitioned from acute care hospitals to forensic hospitals. And the reason for this was that the hope was that all those service lines that I described before would be assumed by private sector hospitals. And we see that increasingly, that many of our private sector hospitals have psychiatric units and are able to provide some of what only the state hospitals had provided in years past. Now, salaries have always been a problem at some of our state facilities. In the 1900s, salaries for an attendant, a direct care staff member, ranged from about $18 to $27 per month for a full 12-hour day. Missouri today, we rank number 50 among all our states in terms of how we compensate our state employees. There's some reason to be hopeful. Governor Parsons is making this a real commitment, to the facilities and to its citizens, that we are going to do something to improve the salaries at our facilities. So now we're going to go back to some Q&A here. I'm going to show you some pictures, and I'm going to want people in the audience to guess which particular facility this might be. So let's first take a look at State Hospital A. And I'm hoping for some guesses from people in the audience as to which hospital, which asylum here in Missouri this might represent.
So you have some choices. You have Farmington State Hospital, St. Louis State Hospital, St. Joseph State Hospital, Nevada State Hospital, or Fulton.
Fulton State Hospital, right?
State Hospital. So there's 5 choices.
And we also have some of our mental health centers, places like Malcolm Bliss or Mid-Missouri Mental Health Center as well.
But for right now, it's one of those 5.
She's given you a hint.
I'm trying to help.
So 1 of 5 is the guess here, huh?
Mm-hmm.
Right,
Don't be
checking
shy.
as people type in their answers. So do you happen to know what years each one of those opened?
Oh, I do, and we're going to get to that in a few minutes.
I keep getting ahead of you here. We do have an answer here.
Okay.
First guess is St. Louis.
Wrong.
Nope, actually it's the other side of the state. This is St. Joe State Hospital.
Well, let's see.
And you can see that it is an example of the Kirkbride model. Not a classic one, but still nonetheless an example of one.
And we do have a correct answer, St. Joseph State Hospital.
All right, well, wonderful. So State Hospital B, I will give folks a hint that this was actually constructed toward the very end of the 19th century, and it is not a Kirkbride model.
So in other words, it was the only one to open in the 1900s.
Oh, there you go. go. That's a good hint.
Wink.
See if we have an answer here. Farmington is the
That is correct, absolutely.
And that building still exists. It is now part of Department of Corrections.
I was going to say, is part of St. Joseph, did that go to Department of Corrections as well?
It did.
It did, yes. Here we have, I think, the most beautiful example of the Kirkbride model in Missouri.
Another hint, this one is no longer there.
Or at least not in its current form.
So would you say that it's partial, or?
There's a few buildings left, but the pretty bits you see
Are pretty much gone.
Yeah.
And the hospital is no longer in its current location.
No.
We have a guess of Nevada.
That is correct. This is Nevada State Hospital.
I had the pleasure of going to Nevada a few weeks ago and had a little tour, some urban exploration, if you will, from a former employee,
Wonderful.
from her car. It was all legal.
Okay. What about this facility?
It's not one of the 5 state hospitals. He's tricking you.
I am.
So this one is not one of the 5 that you listed there.
It's not.
It is not. It
This
is
is a
a
sneaky
state
one.
facility, but it was never entirely considered a state hospital.
It's on the other side of the state from St. Louis, if that helps. I don't know that it would help me, but it might help someone.
We have a couple more guesses in Nevada, but they could be running behind here. We have one of Fulton State Hospital.
No, this is Western Missouri Mental Health Center in Kansas City. Now next, one near and dear to my heart.
Oh, my heart, too. Both of our hearts. So you shouldn't get this wrong, because we kind of just gave you the answer.
I was going to say, I want to answer this one. But I'll wait and I'll give you a piece of trivia whenever we get our correct answer here. Here we are. This person said Marshall, but I don't think that that's right.
No, that's not it.
No.
Good try. And Marshall Habilitation Center was never a state psychiatric hospital. It was a habilitation center.
To be fair, it is in the same direction as the other one, so
It
maybe they
is.
were thinking of that.
Let's see if we've got any other guesses here. Not so far.
If you've ever been to Ted Drew's on Chippewa, you should notice that upper right-hand picture there. You can see that from the parking lot of Ted Drew's. Only.
Now somebody has SMMHC, which I'm not sure what that stands for.
That's Southeast Missouri Mental Health Center, but that was one of our prior facilities. Now, it could be someone just getting in late.
Could be. Let's see what we got there. We don't have any others yet. Let's see. Nobody else yet.
Well, rather than keep everyone on tenterhooks, then Amanda's going to give us our answer here.
It's St. Louis Psychiatric Rehabilitation Center, or St. Louis State Hospital.
And the feature Amanda was referencing is the dome that you can see in the upper right-hand picture there of the slide, which is a prominent feature of virtually anywhere you go in St. Louis.
I was going to say the dome can be seen whenever you're coming in from downtown heading towards the west.
Kelly, you had an anecdote to share?
I was just going to put personal trivia out there. I spent 15 years above the door of the dome, right above the front door in the dome building. 15 years, and my office is right there, as well as time in Kohler building, which is in the older picture there, right out front of the dome building.
Nice.
And virtually anyone everyone who's worked in the mental health field in St. Louis has some St. Louis psych rehab story.
Also, nurses. Pretty much any nurse in St. Louis has done their psych rotation at our hospital.
Absolutely. Now we have another example of the Kirkbride model.
This is close to his heart.
This is also close to my heart.
This looks like a rendering. Is it a picture?
This is actually a real photograph.
Wow, it looks very much on my screen like a rendering of a
does
picture
kind of.
there.
It's in the middle of the state, and we talked about it earlier.
Let's see, we've got people typing in here.
Well, you kind of even gave it away with the letter you chose.
It's true.
Oh. Got anybody to take a guess yet? I don't know if they got discouraged with the.
Yeah, let's
St.
not
Louis.
let's not continue to leave people on tenterhooks here. I'll just go ahead and proceed on. This is the grand old dame of asylums in Missouri. This is Fulton State Hospital. This is Fulton State Hospital before its current iteration, and actually even before its last iteration. This building actually burnt down in the 1950s. So now we have here another picture of a not state hospital, but a community mental health center that was operated by the department, or a mental health center. And this is Mid-Missouri Mental Health Center, what is now Missouri University Psychiatric Center. Here is another institution very well known in the St. Louis area. In fact, frequently confused for St. Louis Psych Rehab Center. This is actually Malcolm Bliss, before it became St. Louis Metropolitan Psychiatric Center.
Fun fact, Malcolm Bliss was a real person. He was a doctor in the late 1800s, and he contributed to the St. Louis scandal of they were not going to pay their electric bill, the city wasn't, so he wrote a check for $100 to keep the lights on at the asylum.
And for that, the building was named after him. And here we actually have a little bit of a trick. This was not a separate facility. This was actually the Children's Psychiatric Unit at St. Louis State Hospital, and it went on to become Hawthorne Children's Psychiatric Hospital. So let's take now a look at some of the pictures of today. So what we have here, Hospital A, this was St. Joe State Hospital, now Northwest Missouri Psych Rehab Center, also known as Hospital Number 2, for it was the number 2 facility, number 2 state facility in the Department of Mental Health. There's the original picture, there we are today.
Look at that library.
And one of the things, again, to provide some information about the history here, is that St. Joe came along in 1872, and at its zenith, it was actually the largest state hospital in Missouri, with as many as 3,111 patients. And it remained the largest until the department actually assimilated St. Louis State Hospital later in the 20th century. And one of the absolute gems, and oftentimes not as well known as it should be, is the brainchild of this gentleman you see here on this slide. That's George Glore, and he essentially collected a lot of mental health memorabilia, both from within and outside the state, over these hospitals' history, and put them together in an absolutely wonderful museum that St. Joe used to operate. It's located on the former hospital properties, and I think has now been assumed ownership of by the St. Joe Historical Society.
And you started to say Dr. Glore. I was trying to remember what George's position was there. I think he was in human resources, wasn't he?
He was an occupational therapist at one point, I know.
Oh, okay.
But yeah, the Glore Psychiatric Museum is wonderful, and if you were ever in St. Joe's, you should go. It's very cost efficient. It's only like $5.
And it's like 45 minutes north of Kansas City proper. So if you have some reason to go through Kansas City, it's well worth stopping and doing a side trip for. What you see here is a picture of a fire at St. Joe State Hospital that took place in 1879. You heard me make allusion to the fire that burnt down Fulton State Hospital. Unfortunately, this was an all too common effect at many of our state hospitals. Here we see the picture of the present-day Southeast Missouri Mental Health Center, the former Farmington State Hospital. There is the picture from before, the picture of today. And this was State Hospital number 4. And It was actually constructed beginning in 1899 and opened to receive patients in 1903. And as I said, the Kirkbride model at this point had already fallen out of favor. This was a fairly large facility at its zenith as well. In the 1940s and 50s, it had nearly 2,000 patients in it. It helped pioneer some of the procedures like hydrotherapy. And one of the things for which it was particularly well known are some of the pictures that you'll see following here. Are cottages. It had a number of very lovely patient cottages. The treatment spaces were on the first floor. The living environment was on the second. And if you go to many of the state facilities today, you'll see that many of them have cottages on their campuses. St. Louis, Farmington, St. Joe all have cottages. Fulton in its past had cottages as well. But this is actually where that kind of concept first began.
Mm-hmm. So it was the Kirkbride plan where everything was in one building, and then it was the cottage plan where you had things sort of separated out. And now it's kind of a little bit of both.
Indeed. Mm-hmm. And here's a picture of the cemetery at Southeast. They've certainly maintained their cemetery quite lovely. We still have cemeteries that are cared for at Fulton, and I believe also at Nevada as well. Again, for many of these grave sites, there are no markers or no markers that can readily identify who were buried underneath them. When Fulton State Hospital burnt down, we lost all records of who was buried where.
St. Joe's has their cemetery as well.
Yes, they do. Here you see what is now Southwest Missouri Psych Rehab Center, or the successor to Nevada State Hospital. That was that wonderful Kirkbride model that we showed you earlier. They were State Hospital actually number 3, so they were the next one constructed after St. Joe. This was known as a Second Empire style Kirkbride building, and that's one reason it was such a notable look.
It was also the longest continuing building in, I think the Midwest. It was over a mile long, I think. It was big.
It was a huge facility. Mm-hmm. Now, it formally closed in 1991, but state operations were resurrected, and a new facility opened in El Dorado Springs in 1997. And in 2014, Southwest began operations as a Pathways Community Mental Health Center program. One of the fun facts about Nevada State Hospital is this particular book that you see here, known as the Electric Pencil. This was discovered in a trash can by a teenager in 1970. Behind a Dairy Queen. And it was this album full of basically native art. And the album was purchased by a collector by the name of Harris Diamant, who purchased it from that teenager in 2006. So that teenager hung on to it for some 30 plus years. Mm-hmm. And Mr. Diamant hired a detective to try and figure out where did this artwork come from. And he was able to track it down and found out that it was the brainchild of one James Edward Deeds, a person who had been a patient at Nevada State Hospital from age of 28 for some 37 years until his placement in a nursing home. That work was then published, and by the way, it's available today on Amazon if people want to see it. It's some absolutely wonderful illustrations.
And it was very mysterious because each picture was made on basically scrap paper. So on the reverse side, it would be like a purchasing request form, and it would have a date of 18 whatever. So everyone couldn't figure out, was this from the 1800s? Was it from current times? It was all very mysterious.
Next hospital here is the Center for Behavioral Medicine, the former Western Missouri Mental Health Center. There's the original picture, the picture from today. And this actually has a very interesting history. It began as the Psychiatric Receiving Center, which was maintained by the Greater Kansas City Health Foundation. And it began in 1984, and it was the very first racially integrated hospital in Kansas City. And so far as I know, probably the state. I won't say that definitively, but I've not been able to find out any information to the contrary. And then the city at that time purchased General Hospital Number 2, which had been a hospital set aside for the medical treatment of African Americans. It was purchased by the city and then by the state, remodeled and enlarged, and then both these structures were opened as Western Missouri Mental Health Center in 1996. And then it began operating as a Department of Mental Health facility in 1970. And it shares Hospital Hill with a lot of other very notable institutions, Truman Medical Center, the Kansas City Psychoanalytic Institute, etc. Here's what I call the junior high school, because that's sort of what St. Louis Psych Rehab Center looks like today. So this is the front of our current building. Here's our original, with some structures that are no longer present in our campus. All those wings to the side of the dome have since been demolished, and the Kohler building that sits in front of that has since been torn down. So St. Louis County Insane Asylum, or Lunatic Asylum, actually opened in 1869, so it was the second psychiatric hospital in Missouri, but it was not a state facility. It was a county facility. The city had not yet grown up around that particular location. When the city and county famously separated in 1876, and the city did grow up around the property, it became the St. Louis City Insane Asylum, and it pretty much persisted in that way. I think in 1910 it was called the City Sanitarium, and then in 1948, the city fathers, seeing all these other state hospitals spring up around the state, and distressed by all the tax dollars that were going to the maintenance and operation of the building, sold it to the state of Missouri for the princely sum of $1, at which point it became St. Louis State Hospital, and the name by which it was known up until 1997, when our new facility was constructed and we became St. Louis Psych Rehab Center. And you can see that once it became part of the state system, it was the largest one. It had a population in its first year of operation as a state facility of 3,400 and grew to as many as 4,400. We still conduct tours of the dome. Amanda gives you some absolutely wonderful ones, as do I. And so if you're ever in St. Louis and want to see what the state psychiatric hospital looked like, go up into our dome, get a number of other fun facts about the history, contact either Amanda or myself. And here are some pictures from some of our other celebratory events over the years. And we just had a very significant one. We just celebrated our sesquicentennial a couple of Tuesdays ago.
He loves that word.
I do. I use it every chance I get. Now on to the Grand Dame. So this is Fulton State Hospital. This is an artist's rendering, Kelly. I do have an actual picture. The viewpoint isn't quite as nice, but this is the facility as of today. We already have folks moved into it, but not patients. That won't be happening until July of this year. The grand opening is going to happen on May 22nd. If you happen to be somewhere in central Missouri at that time, you might want to come by and take a look. It is going to be an amazing, amazing facility. In fact, I think it will be the preeminent forensic hospital in the country. So there is a picture of the original facility, quite a contrast from that. And again, it was authorized by the legislature in 1847, first accepted patients in 1851. At its height, it had 2,500 patients. This was in the late 40s. And we've had a number of things from Fulton State Hospital end up at the Smithsonian. Here's an example of a patient's artwork that she decorated, and it was such an amazing example of some creativity and of someone's successful and heroic struggle against mental illness that the Smithsonian took it. Here we see Missouri University Psychiatric Center, MUPC, formerly Midmo Mental Health Center, or State Hospital Number 10. And this was the original part of the university hospital right here. Now, one of the things that's notable about Mid-Missouri Mental Health Center, it was the first publicly funded community mental health center under Kennedy's 1963 Community Mental Health Center Act. So not only did Missouri have the first psychiatric hospital west of the Mississippi, it also had the very first federally funded community mental health center. And it was also notable for having the first publicly funded chemical dependency unit in the country. Property was transferred to the University of Missouri in 2009 and now operated by the university as the Missouri University Psychiatric Center. I had the pleasure of operating this facility for about 3 years, and one of the things that's really amazing about this hospital is that over its 42-year lifespan, it served some 10,000 patients through its doors. Here we have Metropolitan St. Louis Psych Center, Malcolm Bliss, originally, or Mental Health Center number 9. And there's the original picture. It opened in 1938, again, as another St. Louis City hospital system facility. But in '64, it was recognized as or operated by the Department of Mental Health. And during the construction of the brand new facilities of both Metropolitan Psych Center and St. Louis Psych Rehab Center, we actually housed them on the grounds of St. Louis State Hospital for 3 years, for 2 years, which has contributed significantly to the confusion that still occurs to this day about which facility is which. Now, Malcolm Bliss is still in operation, but is a heavy metal band in California. Check them out on Facebook. Here is Hawthorne Children's Psychiatric Hospital, or Hospital number 26. Again, there is the children's unit at St. Louis State Hospital, from which it began. It actually sprang up out of the children's units that had been operated both at St. Louis State Hospital and at Malcolm Bliss. Both of those facilities were combined and operated as a unit of the state hospital in 1976, before it was formally established as its own hospital in 1851. Hawthorne is notable for a number of things. At this point, it's the only departmentally operated children's facility in the state, but it also remains one of only 74 programs internationally certified as a sanctuary institute hospital, meaning that it has real competence in the treatment of children's trauma. Moving on now to just some snapshots of how these facilities have grown and changed over time. I want to give you a little bit of an overview of what facilities looked like in 1924 as compared to 2014, some 90 years later. You can see that the population has shrunk dramatically from 5,400, and this was well before the heydays of the 50s, when we probably were closer to 8,000 or 9,000, but we're down to about 1,187 in 2014. In sharp contrast, the number of staff at these facilities has grown exponentially. We operated 5,400 beds with only 790 staff. Today, we operate 1,100 beds with some 3,653 employees. And just to give you an indication of how much of a difference that makes to at least some of the staff, there you can see the caseload that one particular physician might have. In the 1920s, that was 412 patients. Today, it's 31. So quite a bit better medical care can be provided with that level of caseload. The per diem costs, or the daily costs, have grown quite a bit as well, from 89 cents a day to around 515. And you can see that the expenditures have grown accordingly, from $3.4 million to about $250 million. Here you have a sense of the census between 1912 and 1964, before these hospitals began to empty out. And you can see again the red is St. Joe State Hospital. You can see how long it was the largest facility in the Department of Mental Health. You'll see the blue line Fulton and the gray line Nevada kind of keep neck and neck up until about the 1940s, at which point Fulton began to take off in size and Nevada contract. And then you see Farmington as essentially the smallest of the facilities, even though, remember, it had as many as 2,000 patients in it. And then here comes St. Louis State Hospital, the green line, in the 1940s, late 1940s, and sort of dominates all of them in terms of the census operated. And here's another way of looking at some of that same information. And you can see that beginning in the 1950s, you see a steady trend downward, a little blip up there in 1955, 56, I believe. And so, again, one of the things to remember that was going on, again, was the whole deinstitutionalization movement. There had been a significant outcry among many advocacy groups around the country, in fact, around the world, about the impact of long-term institutionalization on people with a serious and persistent mental illness, and there was a growing consensus that that was not the appropriate care. and particularly when people were suffering such incredible population pressures that they were stacked one right on top of the other. And so with the advent of the community mental health center movement, with the advent of things like Thorazine and Mellaril, with the advent of both Medicaid and Medicare, and opportunities to fund mental health care differently, the facilities began to empty out in the 1960s. And that's that gray line. You can see sort of us begin to fall off a cliff in terms of the census, pretty much from the 60s all the way through the aughts. Now, this graph also demonstrates one other very disturbing factor here is that green line immediately underneath the gray represents the correctional population. And one of the things that you notice is that as the hospital population empties out, some 5 to 10 years later, you see a corresponding jump in the correctional population. And you can see that represented in the combined population in that red graph as well. And one of the things that many advocates have said is that, regrettably, our community mental health centers have not been sufficiently funded to provide all the services that so many of the deinstitutionalized clients needed. And as a result of that, we have a return to some of what Dorothea Dix most wanted to combat, which is a substantial percentage of individuals in correctional and jail environments with serious and persistent mental illness, somewhere around 16%. In fact, the largest state hospital, or the largest mental health facility, that's the proper term, the largest mental health facility in the country is either the Cook County Jail in Chicago or the Los Angeles County Jail in terms of numbers of institutional beds operated. Here you can see what's happened in terms of bed operation from the 1990s through about 2012. The blue line represents the total number of beds operated either privately or by the Department of Mental Health or federally. And you can see that the one thing they have in common is that those numbers dropped pretty precipitously between 1990 and around 2002 and then began to level off. And we seem to have reached a sort of steady state at this particular point. Unfortunately, that drop has been accompanied by some drop in privately operated beds as well, in addition to some of the drop in the beds operated by the Department of Mental Health. And taking a look at bed types and the kinds of clients served, you can see a couple of other very significant factors. If you look at that very first line, people who are voluntary by guardian, you can see that people who do not have forensic histories, who come in because a guardian admitted them, that population has dropped dramatically over the years. From 2013 through 2015, it's dropped 31%. Interestingly enough, the number of people who've been adjudicated not guilty by reason of mental disease or defect have also dropped. Not quite as much, but nearly so, some 26%. The populations that have dramatically increased, by contrast, have been people who've been found incompetent to stand trial. That population has grown some 48%. And then individuals who've been detained as sexually violent predators who've grown dramatically as well. So the population has become much less non-forensic and much more forensic over time, and just in a 3-year period. Here you have a snapshot of the number of beds operated by each of the state psychiatric hospitals. You can see that we have a total of some 1,219 beds. The largest facility by far is Fulton at 399. Southeast Missouri has given it a run for its money at 348, whereas some of the smallest facilities are Metropolitan Psych Center and Hawthorne Children's Psychiatric Hospital at 50 and 44 beds respectively. And one of the points to sort of drive home here is that the department serves some 75,000 people annually, but all but 1,200 of them are being served in the community and doing very well, thank you. Community mental health treatment works. This is a sense of the revenue that the facilities operate, realize, and you can see that most of the revenue generated is through one of 3 sources, either Medicare or Medicaid. Those are the green columns, or what's known as disproportionate share. These are dollars that the federal government provides the state for operating beds on behalf of people who really don't have any insurance and don't have any other options. And that's $150 million of the $170 million generated. And thanks to disproportionate share, the Department of Mental Health returns to state revenues approximately 65 to 70% of the cost of their operation. So let's talk a little bit about the future of state hospitals or mental health centers. And I'm borrowing here a line from The Tempest, spoken by Sebastian. What's past is prologue. And of course, what that all means is that everything that's led up to now, including our present, really sets the stage for what we're going to become. So I'm kind of curious, what do people in the audience think will be the future role of state psychiatric hospitals?
Well, we already had the question of where they think they were going. So
Right.
This
So
is the answer to that question.
I'm curious to see if some people have some ideas.
Got a little bit of a wait here to get people to put in their answers.
Hopefully we still have some folks with us.
I can assure you we do.
Wonderful. It's always gratifying to know we haven't put people to sleep.
Right.
I don't know if they're going to be typing. But,
May have worn them
out
out.
there, yes.
I mean, technically, they could be asleep
That's true.
in front of their computers.
I don't think they're asleep. I haven't answered yet. Oh, here we go. Okay, here we go. State hospital future equals only for individuals who have MI and have possibly committed a crime. That's what they're saying.
Well, I think that answer is certainly true for the immediate future. If you look at what we can readily foresee, that we're going to continue to serve in our forensic role. Although many of the service lines I mentioned that we operated back when we were full-service psychiatric providers have in fact been absorbed by much of the private sector. The one population that people aren't anxious to serve are individuals who have been criminally committed. In many ways, I think that's unfortunately attributable to stigma. You know, while it's true that individuals with mental illness have only a minimally increased risk of dangerousness secondary to serious and persistent mental illness, it's still commonly assumed by many people in the lay population that individuals with mental illness are dangerous. And the forensic population is that small percentage of the overall population which tends to actually satisfy that sort of prejudice. But the reality is that individuals with a serious and persistent mental illness are far more likely to be victims of crimes than to be perpetrators of crimes. And people who are forensic can and do get better, and when they actually leave us, begin to demonstrate a pattern of behavior that's actually less dangerous as compared to the general population. So the bottom line is our hospitals are very good at what they do in terms of treating patients towards their recovery, and our community providers do an absolutely exceptional job of helping to sustain that upon release. But the short answer to that is it's still probably going to be the one service line that no one else is anxious to provide. So I think you can pretty well predict that we are going to be still in the forensic business for the foreseeable future. Our NGRI population, not guilty by reason of mental disease, population is likely to have stabilized over the last 3 years. I don't think it's going to continue to fall much below what it is now. We get about 10 to 15 new NGRI adjudications a year statewide. But the population that will grow and will continue to grow and will put a lot of bed pressure upon our hospitals will be folks who are incompetent to stand trial or have been found permanently incompetent to stand trial. That's what those acronyms IST and PIST refer to. That population is growing over the last 7 to 10 years. It's probably been growing 400% over what it was prior to that period. Similarly growing are individuals who are sexually violent predators. These are individuals who are civilly committed to the department after completing a sentence for a crime. It's not typically our target population, but it is the population that the state of Missouri has asked us to serve. So that population continues to grow by about 20 beds a year. The population that is actually shrinking, and I can see moving towards virtual non-existence, is our voluntary by guardian population. We no longer take voluntaries. We don't even take too many people who are civilly committed. in our state facilities. But there is still a residue of voluntary by guardian patients, but it's been shrinking over the years. So if I were to take St. Louis State Hospital just sort of as an example, currently of my 180 beds, I have 34 patients who are voluntary by guardian. That's about 19% of our census. But when I first began at St. Louis Psych Rehab Center 7 years ago, my second tour of duty, it was closer to probably 30%. And when I first started working for the state, it was closer to 50%. So it's clearly been on the decline, generally secondary to a number of factors, one of which is we're getting better and better at the community and serving people whom we might not otherwise been able to successfully place in the past. We have settings like our intensive community psychiatric rehabilitation center facilities, either cluster departments or intensive residential treatment service homes or psychiatric independent supported living facilities, and they're able to manage clients that we couldn't really manage before fiscal year 11 or so. Additionally, some percentage of our clients age out and they become more tractable and more manageable in nursing facility environments, and that too is resulting in our population of that group or that cohort shrinking. So I agree with the person who put that guess in. Our next 5, 10, 15 years is likely to be serving that population. But I would like to think a little bit more about a couple of other things. One of which is that there's been an interesting position paper that was put out by the National Association of State Mental Health Program Directors. Our own Dr. Joe Parks, who was the division director at one time of Comprehensive Psychiatric Services, and one of his counterparts from another state, Dr. Radke. And they talked about the vital role of the state psychiatric hospital. And one of the things they challenged mental health authorities to consider is that we need to be serving more people than just forensic clients. We need to be looking at serving individuals who have severity or chronicity of illness that the private sector just can't successfully manage and our community providers just can't quite find solutions for. And a very similar article was published in the JAMA in 2015 by those authors there, Sisti, Siegel, and Emanuel, and they too called for the return to the asylum. This provoked a real firestorm of articles in both the professional as well as the lay literature. There were articles in Psychology Today and The Atlantic and Mental Health America from the National Council, all weighing in either pro or con that particular argument. But one of the things that those articles did call for were a fully integrated private-public partnership between inpatient psychiatric hospitals and community providers, looking to serve individuals who are not just forensic, but also had some of those same kinds of psychiatric challenges. And examples of that are the Worcester Recovery Center and Hospital in Massachusetts, and then actually an example here in our own state, Southwest Missouri Psych Rehab Center. And what they had was very much of an integrated inpatient community model. And what that meant was that there was a small percentage of beds in those facilities that were directly operated by either the state mental health authority or a contracted provider, but they were dedicated to and in effect owned by the local community mental health center, which controlled any and all admission and discharge decisions, so that the community decided through its utilization review mechanisms which patients needed to be in inpatient care or which patients could be successfully managed in the range of community placement options and service options that the community provider itself could wrap around them. And for its part, then the inpatient facility would essentially provide the treatment that the community mental health center asked for in relationship to those specific problems that precluded those clients from being successful in the community until they could, in essence, be successfully returned to and live successfully in whatever level of care was most appropriate for them. Now, such models, I think, envision really a full partnership between inpatient providers and community providers. And my hope is that at some point in the not-too-distant future, this too will be a part of what Missouri Asylums will once again begin to offer. It won't be our primary service line, but I think it should be a service line that we consider. And if we're able to do that, then the work of Dorothea Dix will not have been forgotten, and her dream will not have been forgotten. And we'll continue to be able to offer to many people with psychiatric illnesses a level of care and a level of sanctuary and safety and safe haven that they might not otherwise obtain. And with that, I think we're done, and we're ready to take whatever other questions the audience might have of us.
Okay, folks, if you want to go ahead and click on the link that you've been clicking on to ask your questions, we'll take any final questions from folks out there about the topic. And I want to thank Dr. Vincenz and Ms. Hunyard for being here today and tackling this topic. It's quite extensive for the state, as you could tell, and very interesting. I know we've already gotten one thank you for putting on the topic in the chat.
Wonderful. Only too happy to have done it.
Maybe we should do a sequel.
We have a question about the slides being available, so I guess I'll go into that while we wait for any other questions.
Sure.
So after the program is over, we're going to go ahead and release this as an archive, and in that archive there'll be a link below the video where you can click and download the slides so that you can see all of the archival images and so forth that you'd like to. And so that'll be sent out in an email after the program has been uploaded and put into the archive. So watch for it in a day or so. So far, no other questions have come in. Do you have any final thoughts while folks type in their questions?
Well, again, I think this has been something that I've certainly been very fascinated in over the length of my career. I've spent most of my career working in or behalf of inpatient psychiatric hospitals that the department has operated. I've also had the pleasure of working in our community system, and I can see what happens when both groups work in very close partnership with one another and the absolutely terrific outcomes we can generate for our clients. I know Amanda is a fantastic historian and has added quite a bit essentially to the archive of what we've been able to maintain at St. Louis State Hospital. Anything you want to say on that?
If you're ever in St. Louis and you want to come visit, I'm up for it. Just come email me, call me.
Okay, we do have a question here. What is the approximate length of stay for current patients in the state hospitals?
It's a great question. It varies quite a bit depending upon the nature of the facility. So, for example, the Center for Behavioral Medicine and Metropolitan Psych Center, Kansas City and St. Louis respectively, serve individuals who are requiring restoration of competence. The length of stay for those folks can be somewhere between 90 to 180 days. Sometimes on the short end of that, sometimes a little bit longer than that. Individuals who are found permanently incompetent to stand trial, who are found not guilty by reason of a mental disease or defect, and come to facilities such as myself's at St. Louis Psychs, or at Southeast Missouri Mental Health Center in Farmington, or Northwest Missouri Psych Rehab Center at St. Joe, can have lengths of stay that are much closer to 4 to 6 years.
Another question here. What do you think is the best representation of modern institutions in the modern media?
That's a fascinating question. So which representations best capture what's going on today? I don't know that I can point to an example that captures what it is that we do that we do today. There have been some very good screen adaptations that really address mental health stigma and that present much more hopeful images of what people can accomplish even while struggling with schizophrenia or bipolar disorder. But to find one that actually characterizes the role of the state psychiatric facilities in that process, I can't think of one.
I did just read a really interesting memoir called The Collected Schizophrenias by Esme Wang. And she is an author who has a diagnosis of schizophrenia, and she talks about her different journeys through life. I found that to be pretty accurate and fascinating. But otherwise, I really can't think of anything, which goes back to the whole stigma of mental illness that we discuss.
So,
Okay, we'll close with just a couple of pieces of trivia from the folks out in the audience. I don't know if you realize it, but Dorothea Dix has a Facebook page.
Ooh.
So she's even with us in the modern age.
I'll have to check it out. I'm not aware of that.
And a lot of folks send in, accolades thanking us for the presentation, and are looking forward to sharing it with their peers who couldn't watch it today. And I want to thank you, Dr. Vincenz, again, and Ms. Hunyar for this topic and for being with us today. And folks, we hope to see you at our next presentation and possibly at this year's Department of Mental Health Spring Training Institute on May 30th and 31st this month. Thank you, everyone, for joining us, and we'll see you next time.
Take care, all.